The morning Carter texted, "We need to talk," instead of calling. Margaret knew she'd already lost. 22 years of building that company, and her own boss had decided one phone call wasn't worth giving her. Welcome to her silent triumph, where quiet women outlast loud betrayals. Stay until the end. Margaret had started at Halbrook Logistics, the same year the building still had the old loading dock out back, the one they eventually paved over for a parking lot. She was 26 then, sharp-eyed and underpaid, hired as a dispatch coordinator by a man who barely remembered her name for the first 6 months. That man was Carter's father, Edwin Halbrook, and he was the only person at that company who had ever, in any real sense, seen her. Edwin used to say Margaret had the kind of mind that doesn't need to be told twice. He meant it as the highest compliment he had, and over the years it became true in ways even he hadn't predicted. She learned the freight routes better than the men who'd been driving them for a decade. She learned the billing software before it finished installing it company-wide. She learned, eventually, how every single piece of Halbrook Logistics fit together. Which clients paid late and which paid early, which drivers needed a firm hand and which needed encouragement, which vendors were quietly overcharging by 2 or 3% in ways nobody else had bothered to notice. By the time Edwin retired, Margaret was director of operations, and everyone in that building, drivers, dispatchers, accountants, even the regional sales reps who flew in twice a year, understood that if you wanted something to actually happen, you went to Margaret first and the org chart second. Carter inherited the company the way some men inherit a watch. He wore it. He didn't understand the mechanism. He was 34 when his father stepped down, soft-handed and golf-tanned, with an MBA from a program that had taught him to talk about synergy and disruption, but had never once taught him how a flatbed gets loaded in under 9 minutes during a Tuesday rush. He smiled a lot in meetings. He used Margaret's name often and warmly, the way you pat a tool you're proud to own. For the first 2 years, that arrangement worked well enough. Carter made the speeches. Margaret made the company run. The trouble arrived with a name, Desmond Cole. Desmond had gone to business school with Carter, not as a classmate exactly, more as a fraternity brother who'd later done 2 unspectacular years at a consulting firm before getting let go in a round of layoffs that, depending on who told the story, either had nothing to do with him or had everything to do with him. He showed up at the Halbrook holiday party that December with his hand already extended, like he expected the building to belong to him by spring. He laughed loud at Carter's jokes. He called Margaret sweetheart once, in front of 3 drivers, and she let it slide because making a scene over a word felt small compared to what came 8 weeks later. Carter called her into his office on a Thursday in February. He didn't ask her to sit. That was the detail Margaret kept returning to afterward, 22 years, and he didn't ask her to sit down. "I want to bring Desmond in as VP of Operations," he said, already looking past her at his monitor like the conversation was a formality he needed to clear off his desk before lunch. "I think it's the right move for where the company's headed. Modern approach. Fresh energy." "I'm the director of operations," Margaret said, because someone had to say the obvious thing out loud. "Right, and look, nothing changes for you day to day. You'll still handle the floor stuff, the dispatch side. Desmond's going to focus more on strategy, client relationships, that kind of thing." Carter finally looked at her, and there was something almost apologetic in his face, the closest thing to honesty he'd shown her in 2 years. "He's got connections, Margaret. People my dad never had access to. I need someone who can get us in rooms we've never been in." What he meant, and what it took her exactly 4 months to fully understand, was that he needed someone who looked the part in those rooms. Someone with the right last name dropped at the right dinner. Someone who played golf with the kind of men who signed 7-figure contracts. Margaret had built the company's actual machinery with her bare hands for over 2 decades, and none of that mattered now next to a firm handshake and a Stanford ring. She didn't cry in that office. She didn't raise her voice either. She'd learned, somewhere in her 40s, that the women who survived rooms like that one were the women who left no fingerprints of their fury anywhere a man could later point to and say, "See, emotional. Difficult, hard to work with." "Understood," she said. "I'll make sure he's briefed on the active accounts." Carter's shoulders dropped half an inch with relief. He'd expected a fight. He didn't get one. That, more than anything, should have told him something, but men who inherit things rarely learn to read the silence of the people who built them. Desmond's first month was, by his own description to anyone who'd listen, a total reset. He renamed the dispatch software's internal categories without consulting the dispatch team, because the old labels didn't scale. He scheduled 3 offsites in 6 weeks to discuss operational vision, none of which produced a single document that touched an actual truck route. He brought in a logistics optimization consultant, a man named Phil who billed $400 an hour to ask the drivers questions Margaret had already answered in a 14-page internal memo 2 years prior, a memo that was still sitting unread in the company's shared drive. Margaret watched all of it with the particular calm of a woman who has already done her grieving privately and is now simply waiting to see how the math plays out. Because she knew something Desmond didn't, and something Carter had apparently forgotten in his rush to impress whoever he was trying to impress. A company doesn't run on titles. It runs on the 1,000 invisible decisions made correctly, every single day, by the people who actually understand how the parts fit together. She kept doing her job. She didn't sabotage anything, that wasn't her nature. And besides, sabotage leaves fingerprints too. She simply stopped doing the things that had never technically been her job in the first place, the things she'd absorbed over 22 years out of sheer competence and care. She stopped flagging the billing discrepancies before they became client complaints. She stopped quietly smoothing over driver scheduling conflicts before they became HR issues. She stopped translating Carter's vague, strategic mumbling into instructions the warehouse floor could actually use. She didn't stop because she was vindictive. She stopped because, for the first time in over 2 decades, nobody had asked her to keep doing it. Desmond had made it very clear in word and tone that he considered her old systems legacy thinking. Fine. Let the legacy thinking go quiet and see what filled the silence. What filled the silence was chaos, slow and then sudden, the way a building doesn't look unstable until the day it is. It started small. A regional client, Brennan Freight Partners, called in March furious that 3 consecutive shipments had been routed incorrectly, a problem Margaret would have caught in the scheduling software within an hour, but which sat unnoticed for 4 days because Desmond had reorganized the alert system and nobody had told the dispatch team how to read the new flags. Brennan had been with Halbrook for 11 years. They didn't leave immediately. But they asked, pointedly, in an email Margaret was CC'd on but not asked to respond to, "Has something changed over there?" Something had changed, just not in any direction Desmond understood. By April, 2 senior dispatchers quietly put in for transfers to the warehouse floor, a demotion, technically, but one that came with less daily exposure to Desmond's habit of taking credit for solutions in meetings that he'd actually learned about from the dispatch team an hour earlier. Margaret didn't ask them to do this. She simply noticed, with a kind of tired clarity, that the people who'd worked alongside her for years were starting to vote with their feet, the same way she had voted with her silence. Carter, for his part, seemed genuinely confused by all of it. He'd corner Margaret in the hallway sometimes, his face doing that thing it did when he wanted reassurance without wanting to admit he needed it. "Things feel a little bumpy lately," he'd say. "Anything I should know about?" "Desmond's got it," Margaret would answer, every time with a smile that gave away nothing. And every time it was true in the most literal sense. Desmond did have it. He just didn't know what to do with it. The first real crack came in May, with the Patterson account, Halbrook's single largest client, a regional grocery distributor whose contract represented nearly 18% of the company's annual revenue. Margaret had personally managed that relationship for 9 years. She knew the warehouse manager's daughter's name. She knew which loading bay had a faulty sensor that needed manual override every other Tuesday. She knew, because she'd built the knowing brick by brick over nearly a decade, exactly how much slack that account could absorb before something broke. Desmond decided, 3 weeks into a renewal negotiation, he'd insisted on running personally, that he didn't need any of that information. He went into the renewal meeting with Patterson's logistics VP, armed with a slide deck full of synergistic value propositions, and a renewal offer that Margaret learned later, secondhand, from a dispatcher who'd overheard the warehouse manager venting on a call increased rates by 11%, while quietly removing 2 service guarantees that Patterson's entire ordering system was built around. Patterson didn't sign. Patterson didn't even counter. Patterson's VP called Carter directly, skipping Desmond entirely, and used the word insulting twice in a 4-minute conversation that Carter later described to Margaret, in a voice gone thin with panic, as the worst phone call of my professional life. "Why didn't anyone catch this before it went out?" Carter demanded. Standing in her doorway now, he came to her now, which was its own quiet vindication. "Desmond ran the renewal independently," Margaret said. "He told the team he didn't need input from operations on pricing structure. I have the email if you'd like to see it." She did have the email. She'd kept it, not as ammunition exactly, but the way you keep a receipt, because a woman who has spent 22 years being asked to prove things learns never to throw away the proof. Carter didn't ask to see it. He just stood there for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, not quite an apology, not yet, but the first crack in the certainty he'd been wearing since February. Patterson gave Halbrook 30 days to present a revised offer before they opened bidding to 2 competitors. 30 days. Margaret had spent 9 years building a relationship that survived a warehouse fire, 2 driver strikes, and 1 CEO transition. Desmond had nearly ended it in a single afternoon with a slide deck. She could have let it end there. Some part of her, tired, and not without its own bitterness, wanted to watch Patterson walk and let Carter learn, the expensive way, what happens to a company when you decide the person who built it is interchangeable with anyone holding the right diploma. But Margaret had built Halbrook Logistics with her own hands over 22 years, and there's a particular kind of love that doesn't disappear just because the people running things forget to honor it. She thought about the dispatchers who'd transferred rather than fight. She thought about the drivers who'd start losing routes, losing hours, if Patterson actually walked. This wasn't really about Carter or Desmond anymore. It never fully had been. So when Carter finally asked, not ordered, asked, in a voice with real fear in it now, "Margaret, can you fix this?" She said yes. But she said yes on her terms. "I'll take the Patterson account back," she told him, fully, with full authority, no oversight from Desmond's office. "And I wanted in writing that operational decisions on key accounts route through me going forward, not as a favor, as the job description." Carter agreed before she'd finished the sentence. It took her 11 days to rebuild what Desmond had broken in 1 afternoon. She drove out to the Patterson warehouse herself, sat across from the logistics VP with nothing but a legal pad and the specific, granular knowledge of exactly how their operation worked, knowledge that no amount of business school had ever taught Desmond, and that no slide deck could substitute for. She didn't apologize for Halbrook's mistake by groveling. She apologized by demonstrating, in precise and unglamorous detail, that the people who actually understood Patterson's business were still in the building. She restructured the offer herself, preserved both service guarantees, and found 3% in efficiency gains elsewhere that more than covered the rate adjustment Patterson actually needed. Patterson signed a 3-year renewal. The VP, shaking her hand at the end of it, said simply, "Glad you're still the one running things over there." She was, as it turned out, the one running things. She always had been. It just took a near disaster for the company to remember it out loud. Desmond didn't last the summer. There wasn't a dramatic firing. No public reckoning. Carter wasn't built for those any more than he was built for operations. Instead, Desmond's role quietly narrowed, meeting by meeting, until VP of Strategy became a title with no actual strategy attached to it, and by August he'd taken a position at a different firm, one that hadn't yet learned what Halbrook had learned the hard way. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply kept doing the work nobody else could do, the same work she'd been doing quietly for 22 years, except now it came with the title and the authority that should have been hers from the beginning, and a boss who, for the first time, actually asked before he assumed. That's the whole story. Sometimes the truest justice isn't loud. It's just a company finally falling apart long enough to remember who built it, and a woman steady enough to be standing there when they came looking.